Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today for a 30 on Thursday webinar evaluating your user experience in your business process applications. Just a little bit about us before we get started. Protiviti is a global consulting firm providing solutions to business problems in technology, business process analytics, and internal audit. Our full-service enterprise content management team has helped hundreds of clients realize the value of SharePoint and Office 365. Our 30 on Thursday webinar series is a bi-weekly webinar series where we talk all things SharePoint and Office 365. Our next webinar will be on June 22nd, where we'll be talking about advanced security management for Office 365 with SharePoint MVP Liam Cleary. You can register for that webinar and see our full event schedule at ecm.protiviti.com. We are providing free 1-hour introductory consultations for our Protiviti On-Demand team. Our support team provides support for Office 365 and SharePoint, also Nintex, and they provide system health checks, user experience and design, business intelligence, and much more. If you're interested in scheduling a free 1 hour, please email us at ecm@protiviti.com. Today's session is being recorded. You can access today's recording and see all of our past webinars on our YouTube channel. For questions during today's presentation, please insert them in the question window of the GoToMeeting toolbar or live tweet us your questions using the hashtag 30TUX. Today's presenter is Maggie Swearingen with Protiviti, and I am Julia Marple, and I will be moderating today's session. Maggie, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Julia, let me know when you can see the agenda.
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. Well, thanks for joining us, everyone. Today I wanted to talk about business application user experience. I think a lot of us have begun to recognize in the last decade, maybe more than that, how important user experience really is to our development of our web products. Often, especially now, I think we are tending to overlook UX, however, when we're developing business applications. And since we're headed toward an age where pretty much everything is digital, everything is online, we're working in a much more ecosystem and productivity environment. This is critical and we can't overlook it. So this session is intended to be an overview of important user experience best practices and patterns that need to be continually considered as you're building your business applications. So let's talk a little bit about digitization. This is a huge buzzword right now. Everybody is digitizing and everybody is moving toward digitization. But I would argue that we really have been doing this probably for almost the last 20 years. It's only in the last 3 or 5 years that there's been a formal name put on it. And what we're beginning to do more and more and more is realize that we have all of these disparate applications out there that are all on the web or in some way digital. But what we're really trying to do now is to begin to tie those together. And I think that that's really where digitization is taking us, is taking our people, our processes, and our data that's all over the place and building business applications that help us pull that data and pull those outcomes and better process it. And of course, this hopefully for all of us will lead to more efficiency, more productivity, and continually growing profits, or if you're in an association, potentially your membership grows, or any sort of goal that your organization has from a business perspective. Continually digitizing your content will help make this happen for us. Sorry. So we have our little Bumblebee there because, again, I really do think that this is a buzzword because this is something that we have been doing for a while now. It's just now that there's a formal name put on it. It's not a matter of when It's not a matter of if anymore. It's just a matter of when. When does your organization finally say that you're ready, that you're really ready to do this? There are a few things that you're going to want to think about as you're doing this and as you're beginning your planning process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few minutes here. But I think the first thing you really want to start to think about is your consumers. And in this case, in this example, your consumers are your teams at your organization. They're the people consuming the technology very often as you're taking a business application or a business process and then turning it into a digital business application. We're going to talk a little bit more about audience identification in a minute, but I think it's critical that you're really considering who your consumers are. You're also going to want to consider where technology is going. I would argue that in the past 3 years to 5 years, really the push toward the cloud has become much more a reality than people were talking about even just a couple years ago. I know from experience working with clients, working with projects, that in the last 18 months I've worked on far fewer on-premise implementations than I have cloud implementations. We continue to see that growing and changing and continuing, and that's a pattern that we're going to continue to see. So as you're considering what applications you're going to be building and as you're planning for your applications, it's very important to plan the future of technology. You don't want to build something locally when all of your other technology is going to the cloud, because eventually that's going to render that application not very useful for your organization. So this is as much about immediate needs as it is about strategic planning when you're starting to do this process. So let's talk a little bit about what you should be reviewing as you're considering building a business application for your organization. And the way I see business applications are, they are really a process that is happening at your organization that you want to somehow take online and digitize. For a lot of us, that means involving workflow. And potentially involving applications that facilitate workflow. We're not just talking with relation to SharePoint and Office 365 either. Really, what we're going to talk about today can apply to any platform that you're really looking at. And the first thing you really need to do is you need to consider task evaluation and who your users are. You know, in UX, we always talk about personas and audiences and how important that is. I would argue that it is more important when you are emulating a process online than it even is when you're talking about a regular old website. There's a big difference between web design and web application design. By and large, websites are for consuming information. Now, of course, there are interactive pieces of websites, but they're really about going and getting information. Web applications, however, are really about interacting with the data and with the information. And so what you're learning and what you need to learn about your users is much more sophisticated in many senses when you're talking about an application than it is just about consumption. And certainly, you know, there are people out there who would argue with that. But what we really want is we want our users to take their task and we want to create efficiencies by doing it digitally. And so we really have to evaluate the tasks that they're doing very closely. And we have to understand when we're watching somebody do this process, if they're an expert in the process already or if they're a novice in the process, because you have to consider that over time, this application is going to be used by people who know the process very, very well, and it's going to be used by new people who continue to come on and interact with the organization. And so we have to consider both sides of the coin there and make sure that we're creating an application that not only speaks to the people who understand the process at a very, very intricate and deep level, but also the people who are very new to the process that we're bringing online. We also want to consider current design patterns, and we're going to talk a lot about this, but what it boils down to is that design patterns in and of itself are ways that you as an organization have decided to consistently solve or communicate things on the web. So a quick example of that would be navigation. If your organization has always done a top of the site drop-down navigation, for example, then when you're designing a business application, choosing a left rail vertical flyout navigation might not be the best choice, because that's a completely new design pattern that you're introducing to people who have become accustomed to a certain design pattern. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then we're going to dig into some components that are very, very common in business applications, and I'll offer some resources and just some simple best practices as you're running into those different components. So task review. Don't underestimate simplicity here. Boil down any action to its simplest form. The way I like to do task review is actually twofold. I like to have an interview, a meeting with, with the user and talk to them about the process. The more specific questions you can ask during that, the better. When they say, and then I send an email, what I say is, who do you send it to? Do you have to copy people on it? Do you have to blind copy people on it? What do you send it as? Do you send it as an attachment, or do you send it in the body? If it's an attachment, is it a PDF or is it a Word document? Anything that really, really gets at the specifics of what they're doing and how they're doing it. That can often happen during the interview process. But then what I like to do is I like to sit down next to them and behind them as they're actually doing it with real data. So not just, well, then I would do this and then I would do this. No, we have an order come in. Okay, come and sit next to me and I'm going to show you exactly what I do to process the order. Often what comes out during that second session, it reinforces what you talked about in the first session, but it also clarifies and adds more detail to the process. And typically it's because the person knows the process so well that they don't often give you as much detail when they're talking to you about it as you actually glean when they're actually doing it. The next step is really taking that process and sketching it out and using flowcharts. You may use wireframing as a possibility. Just making sure that as you're building the application, all of your screens are doing the right things, and in between each screen, all of the appropriate steps are happening. A classic example is, the classic approval workflow. And the question is always, well, what happens when it goes to 3 people for approval, 2 of them approve it and 1 of them rejects it? And that's the kind of process that needs to be worked out in your workflow. If even just 1 person rejects it, it goes back to the beginning. Or the second somebody in the group approves it, it moves on in the steps. Whatever the case is, however that works with your business application and with your organization, that needs to be assessed. You need to take a look at all possible outcomes. And I say keep it simple, but also you want to be thorough. And there's a fine line between the two things, but you certainly don't want to add complexity to a process. So a good example is I'm usually talking with an organization, and the way they do things is they're happy with it. They're fine with it. They aren't necessarily offering any pain points. We're taking that process, we're digitizing it, but then quite often there's another voice in the room that says, well, if it could do X, would that be good for you? Well, sure, most people are going to say yes. But if X is not something that's solving a verbalized pain point, and it's not something that's creating efficiencies, then I would suggest that in the phase 1 of the process that you don't introduce new functionality unless it's solving an existing problem. So don't introduce functionality for the sake of introducing functionality, but try to manage all your possible outcomes. And prototyping. Often UX experts talk about prototyping when it comes to creating websites. Your average website probably doesn't need too much prototyping unless there is some interaction in the site. A web application, however, needs a prototyping step. And truly, you could even use Photoshop, or excuse me, PowerPoint for this. There are plenty of other more sophisticated applications, such as ClickTail, Verify, and Acture, and each one has its own benefits that can help you and help your testing and your gathering of information. But the bottom line is you can use something as simple as PowerPoint and create boxes that people can click on. But the idea is that there has to be a prototype and there has to be user testing. And it's a lot easier to do that in black and white and in sketchy mode than it is to have built something and then to go back and realize that it's not going to work. Also, just a rule of thumb, 5 people are going to tell you 96% of what's wrong with your application. So you really want 3 to 5 people usually to test it, typically from a variety of experience levels, e.g. somebody who's extraordinarily experienced with the process, and then probably somebody who's newer to the department but involved in the process. I mentioned design patterns earlier. Design patterns are a formal way of documenting a solution to a common design problem. In our team, for example, we have put together over the years a bunch of design patterns for how we address certain things. So the idea is that, you address search and a search box in relatively the same way. Now, of course, every client has special needs or perhaps different requests, but the idea is that, search is not in the upper right on one site that you do and in the bottom left on another and in the middle of the page on another, that some of those solutions are relatively consistent. Another common design pattern that you're probably familiar with is what we call the hamburger menu. When you have a responsive design and your website is sizing down to a tablet or a telephone size, the menu condenses and you get that sort of little hamburger looking 3-line menu in the upper left. That's a common design pattern that people are becoming more and more accustomed to and more used to. So the idea is that if you're using any of these patterns consistently across your web products and across your applications, don't then go and decide to use a completely different design pattern. Now, there are certainly times when that statement should be refuted. Because if you're using a design pattern that doesn't work necessarily, well, by all means, find one that works. But that is to say that if you're doing things in a relatively consistent manner, continue to do it that way, because otherwise people are going to have to completely relearn what they're doing. If you're designing several business applications and each one has long forms, for example, don't put the labels for the forms to the left of the form field on 2 of them and on top of the form field on 1 of them. Keep things consistent across. That will make your applications more successful over time. Even if those consistencies aren't necessarily in line with best UX practices, the consistency will be reinforced for the users, and that will overall help them. If you don't have things that are common among your web properties, then I would encourage you to take a look at some resources and try at least to begin to standardize some of those things. This is a good example. This website is a very, very useful resource. They have literally hundreds of examples, good examples of different design patterns. So accordions, many forms, how to fill out forms, dashboards, all manner of common components. You can see these 2 examples are 2 variations on the same theme. They're both drop-down menus with a significant amount of information in them. So, this is a very commonly accepted design pattern. Now, you might remember back, in the early 2000s, it wouldn't necessarily look like this. What we would probably have seen is some sort of fly out to the right, and then you went down another layer and there was another fly out. That's a design pattern that's gone away over time for a variety of reasons. And now you can kind of begin to take a look at more commonly accepted design patterns. And the reason that's useful is because you have to remember that your users aren't just using the web in the context of their work every day, they're using it in their context of their lives. And so enforcing things that they're used to begin with will again make things more consistent and successful over time. So let's take a quick look at some common components and some best practices with those components as you're beginning to design your applications. We have this TSA security form over here, and actually there are things about this form that are done really well, and there are things about this form that could be improved, and so we'll talk about that for a minute. The first thing is keep it short. If there are efficiencies that can be created by the way that data is collected, then do it. I often say that if there's information that can be collected at a later time in the process, then wait and collect it at a later time in the process. You don't want a form where somebody is filling out 150 fields at the very start of this process. And again, your business application may not use forms necessarily, but if it does, you do want to strive to keep it short and concise. You want to keep like fields together, but you also need to remember when you are going to want to differentiate between data. So a good example is an address field. Many of us are we're pretty comfortable with the idea that, it has an address 1 line, maybe an apartment unit number line, city line, state line, zip line, for example. And those are, 5 fields or so that would all be in a row in the form, because those are all things that you think of, in a certain order as you're adding information. But those are also all pieces of information that me, as somebody who then is going to be leveraging this data later on, might want to slice and dice my data by. So what I wouldn't want to do is just put one big address block and hope that somebody types in their address, because then there's going to be no consistency among state, for example. And so I'm not going to be able to break down my information by state if I wanted to, or city if I wanted to, or county if I needed to. So, keeping those fields separate but together in a form allows me greater flexibility with the data later on. It's recommended generally, and you'll see that this isn't this way, and probably more than half the forms we look at aren't this way. But if you can, it's recommended that the label is actually above the field, and that the spacing is good so that you can tell which label goes with which field. That's really only so that people don't run into a situation where they might have to scroll left to right. And also when fields are above when explanations are above fields, that does help on a mobile device typically, because if the wider something is, the less accessible it's going to be on a smaller mobile device. Likewise, really, if you can, you want to stick to a single column layout. I've found that a multi-page or next construct is more effective than multiple columns on one page, for example. And if you do that, you'll want to show progress if the length of the form necessitates it. So you'll always want to say, 33%, 50%, whatever it is, so that a user knows that they're really almost complete. Something else that I thought was very interesting about this form, so they don't have a clear submission button, and I think that that's probably the biggest error that you can find in this form. Preview is meant to be the submission button because you preview it and then you submit, but that's really not very clear. Also, the buttons are on the left, which is somewhat unusual. They typically would fall, under this comments box to kind of to the far right corner of this comments box. So you really you want to have a very, very clear submission or next or progress button on your form. And you also actually, if you can avoid it, you probably don't want a clear form field, because really what will happen, particularly if it's the second button, is people will click it by accident and that will clear their form, and that'll generally upset them. So if you wanted to have some sort of clear form construct, you'd want to put it somewhere different and not give it equal weight from a button perspective than you have currently. Let's talk really quick about tabular data. So tables can be used effectively to display information. And I don't want to confuse this with using tableless implementation and using divs as opposed to using HTML table markup. But there's nothing wrong with conveying information in a business application in a table format. Likewise, there's nothing wrong with including a few different options for inputting data. So these are sort of blurry, and I apologize. But this is an example of a very simple SharePoint contact list, and I think we're all probably relatively familiar with the new button opens a dialog box, and you can fill out the quote form and submit, and the data will go in there. Or you can also flip to datasheet mode. And if you have data in your business application that people are interacting with in this tabular Excel-like, if you will, format, then allowing for either form of input is typically pretty valuable. You see this very often in Access databases, for example, and you can see it in Excel. And it actually reinforces a pattern that people are used to, so they're interacting more efficiently with the business application rather than us creating some sort of completely new way of having them interact with the data. Dashboards and reporting. I think really truly what all of this digitization is building up into is giving us large stores of data that then we can call intelligence from. And there, that's probably several webinars in and of itself about structuring the data and ensuring that the data is ready to be consumed and figuring out how deeply it should be consumed. But I do want to point out that part of this process will be likely creating dashboards and reports. And it's not just creating a dashboard, but creating a useful dashboard. And the process of creating the UI for a dashboard is almost a subset of creating a UI for an entire business application, because you're not just going to have one dashboard in many cases. You're going to have multiple dashboards for multiple audiences, and you don't just want to be filling up white space. This is actually a blog, but I really love this blog entry. I read it recently, and it actually talks about the different types of visualizations of data and the type of data that they're most useful for. So the example that kind of made me chuckle was really who needs the 3D cone that they give you in Excel to display data. Sure, it looks kind of cool, but it really is meaningless. And I think one of the things that we always risk when designing dashboards is over-designing. Dashboards are a candy store for designers, front-end developers, and they shouldn't be. They need to be as clean and as simple as possible and as useful as possible. We don't want to be filling up white space with unrelated, useless information. And so in summary, I just want to say that this process I think it's a process that people are familiar with and that they're used to. I haven't told you anything new probably on the phone today. What I think is important, though, is that we start to take this process that people have become accustomed to and that they've adopted for website development and really start applying it more effectively to our business application development. We need to be planning, we need to be designing, we need to be continually testing and reviewing and iterating. That's how we make our business applications better. We don't just say we need an application that does X, go build it. That, generally speaking, will not build an effective application. So this process that we've come to accept for other web development needs to now be really applied to this act of digitization as we're moving forward as organizations. That's all I had. Julia, were there any questions?
Yeah, we did have a question about the recording. The recording will be up on our YouTube channel. We will be sending out the link to all of the attendees today. We do have a question. How can we follow this process if we have a very short timeline?
That's a great question. This process is really meant to be agile. It is not. It certainly was born out of a lot of waterfall methodologies, but you can very easily apply it to any agile application development that you are doing. UX is a very important, very accepted part of that process. The best way to do that is to remember that this doesn't you don't have to design the entire application at one time. And you can apply this very same process in very small chunks for each different piece of the application. And quite honestly, often when you do that, you end up with a better result over time.
Okay, great. I think that's all the questions we have today. Thanks, Maggie, for the great presentation.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks, everyone, for attending today. We will see you in 2 weeks. Have a great day, everyone.